Hello, this is Colin Liddell, and this is the Shortpod, a brief and succinct podcast commenting on the events and issues of the day. And today it is the 5th of June 2026. Now, the big story back in my native UK is the murder of Henry Nowak, a white youth who was stabbed to death by a Sikh man last December. The story has been suppressed by the media for legal reasons, and now that a trial has taken place and the killer has been sentenced to so-called life imprisonment, the details have emerged. This has become a major flashpoint in Britain's increasingly online social media driven news cycle. And a lot of people are driving their agendas using this case. Some are saying this is a perfect example of two-tier care, a two-tier policing system where ethnic minorities are treated more kindly by the police than working-class white people. The main justification for this narrative is the fact that Henry Nowak, who was stabbed and who soon after died, was actually arrested at the scene of the crime and handcuffed. And it was only later that it became apparent that the Sikh was the murderer, and then he was arrested. Lots of people are comparing it to George Floyd, the black man whose death at the hands of police sparked off Black Lives Matter. There's a very important difference. In the case of George Floyd, he was actually killed by the police, whereas in the case of Henry Nowak, he was killed by a Sikh man who was then arrested and convicted of murder. Now, the police involved in the case, they were perhaps a little bit slow in understanding the exact nature of what had happened to Henry Nowak and who the criminal was. But, this is often the case with criminal incidents. Who the good guy is, who the bad guy is not always apparent. This was doubly so in the case of Henry Nowak because the Sikh killer's brother had phoned the police claiming that his brother had been a victim of a racial attack. In a case like this, the police don't really know which way to turn, so they're likely to arrest the wrong person until they find out what's going on. And this is exactly what appears to have happened in this case. Even though Henry Nowak was fatally stabbed, he didn't bleed out. This is the reason he died. He was actually bleeding inwards, and his lungs were filling up with blood, and this was the actual cause of death. This, combined with the fact that this was a confused incident happening late at night, meant that the police didn't automatically arrest the criminal and instead made what, in retrospect, seems a surprising decision to arrest and handcuff Henry Nowak. Now, shocking as the specifics of this case are, the question has to be asked, what can the police actually in general change to make things better? And the answer to that is practically nothing. The police involved in this case, although they didn't do a particularly good job, they were not doing a particularly bad job. They were not making any major mistakes. They were dealing with an ongoing situation in which different people were saying different things, in which the true facts of the case were still not entirely apparent. And so they had to get a control of the situation, clamp down on everything, and then funnel everything into a process by which they could then elucidate what was going on, which is exactly what the police in this case appear to have done. And the result of that is that they realized who the victim was because he died, and they realized who the murderer was, and he was arrested and, after due process, convicted. Now, the police did have some medical training. Unfortunately, when Henry Nowak accurately claimed to have been stabbed, one of the police officers said "No, I don't think you have been stabbed, mate." And that makes everything sound a lot worse. The fact was that the police were doing what they normally do in situations like that. They were trying to find out what was going on. They were trying to find out who was hurt and how they were hurt. And there are, of course, certain inherent limitations to what they can do in confusing situations like that. So there's not really an easy way to reform police practices in a case like this. Now, a lot of people are very emotionally upset by this case. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of unfocused demand for change, for the police to do something, for the government to do something, but it's still not really clear what they are calling for. One of the things that a lot of people might be in favor of is deprioritizing racism, because the police in the UK typically take accusations of racism very seriously. Now, of course, one reason why the police take accusations of racism seriously is because racism can feed into all sorts of other problems. If there is a racially aggrieved situation, that can itself lead to extreme acts of violence. So the police take racism seriously for quite good reasons. Britain, whether one likes it or not, is a multicultural society. And indeed, it is an increasingly multicultural society. So having ethnic groups going head to head in race wars is probably not conducive to law and order and maintaining the peace. So it would be perhaps a little bit naive to expect the police on the back of this case to radically change the way that they deal with accusations of racism. So once you crunch it down, once you look at all the facts, once you look at all the possible or practical changes that can or cannot be made, there's not really much that will come out of this case. In this respect, it's very similar to a mass shooting in the United States. Occasionally, somebody goes into a school, perhaps, and starts shooting at students, and 10 or 20 people get killed. And there's a big call afterwards by people on the left to ban guns. And then that runs into all sorts of other political and social and cultural facts about America, a country in which banning guns would be extremely difficult to implement. And finally, the whole thing just dies down. And this is kind of what we can expect to see in the case of Henry Nowak, even though it's a very tragic and emotionally provoking incident, even though it stirs up divisions and anger and debate. A lot of that debate just turns out to be hollow, hysterical, emotional signaling that doesn't lead to any concrete political change. So that's kind of my summation of this case. Um, it might have some effect on the Makerfield by-election, which is coming up on the 18th of June, where Andy Burnham is set to win. This story could help boost the Reform candidate. Who knows? We'll see. And if that happens, it will have had a major impact on British politics, because Andy Burnham is all set to replace Keir Starmer as Prime Minister if he wins this by-election. But I don't think they're going to do much else about this. I don't think they're going to ban Sikhs from carrying ceremonial daggers. Bad people, crazy people will continue to do bad things and crazy things. Bad people will continue to get their hands on dangerous implements and use them in illegal ways. And of course, the police will continue to deal with often confusing and perplexing situations in a less than perfect way. So, really, that's all there is to be said about that. Over and out.